Welcome back to The Discoverers. This is Chapter 75, The Discovery of Prehistory. In the 18th century, when Buffon stretched the calendar of nature into tantalizing eons, pious Christians still found the biblical chronology by which Archbishop Usher had fixed the creation at 4004 BC too comforting to abandon. For them, the whole course of early history seemed to run from Eden through Jerusalem and was amply chronicled in the Bible. The ancient events that concerned Christians had occurred exclusively in and around the Mediterranean, and the human heritage was the heritage of Greece and Rome. When Newton made the voyage of the Argonauts the baseline for his chronology, he too kept biblical events in sharpest focus. But what had happened before Bible times? Today we may be amazed that so few Christians asked that question. Yet for believing Christians, the question seemed meaningless. What happened before history? Before anything really happened? Not until the mid-19th century did the word prehistory enter European vocabularies. Meanwhile, thoughtful Europeans had somehow excluded from their historical ken most of the earthly past. Along with the plants and animals and minerals brought back to Europe by missionaries, merchants, explorers, and naturalists came human artifacts for cabinets of curiosities, familiar features of the households of the rich and the powerful. In the Middle Ages, such curious, ancient, and precious objects had been occasionally exhibited too in churches, monasteries, colleges, and universities. In the Renaissance, regal collections, including the booty of battle, the gifts of ambassadors, and the works of court artists, adorned the palaces of popes and Medicis. So were born the great Vatican collections, the Uffizi and the Pitti in Florence, the Louvre in Paris, the Escorial near Madrid, and others in ducal capitals like Dresden, where Winckelmann was first inspired. These were for the delight of a privileged few. The 18th century in Europe saw a new kind of collection, a novel institution, the public museum. The British government pioneered by acquiring the collections of Sir Hans Sloane in 1753, which were open to the public, in 1759. Some private collections, like the Vatican museums, were voluntarily open to the public. Others, like the Louvre, were seized by revolutionaries for the whole citizenry. Across Europe, a new museum public expected to learn, to be delighted, to be entertained. The word tourist entered the English language after 1800 for the mobile community of transient spectators. The hopes of breathless museum explorers were exaggerated by the distances they had traveled. In the United States, and wherever there had not been palaces or royal collections, the public had to start from scratch. New World counterparts appeared. Peale's Museum, 1784, in Philadelphia, the Smithsonian Institution, 1846, in Washington, D.C., and others in South America. Across Asia, in India, Siam, China, Japan, the great collections generally remained the preserve of princely courts or went into the inner sanctums of temples. Only revolutions of one kind or another would open these treasures to public view. From conquered lands, from Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Persia, works of painting and sculpture and even whole buildings were transported to the great museums in London, Paris, Amsterdam, or Berlin. As the European museums grew, at first they showed only the sorts of objects that aristocratic dilettantes had collected for prestige or out of curiosity. Objects of beauty held the spotlight, with occasional items of historical association, such as old crowns, scepters, and orbs, or a rare scientific instrument like an orrery. Objects that were not obviously beautiful or conspicuously strange aroused little interest. Yet, as it turned out, it was precisely these crude, anonymous objects that would open prehistoric vistas to give the public a new vocabulary for all history. As we have seen, surviving objects had a special power to help people grasp the past. But the buried relics in Rome and Greece simply documented a past familiar from sacred or classical literature. The discovery of prehistory through objects would reach back far beyond the written word and vastly extend the dimensions of human history. A strange series of coincidences gave the leading role in this discovery to Danish businessman Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, 1788 to 1865. Without the erudition of a Scaliger or the mathematical genius of a Newton, he was a man of superlative common sense, richly endowed with the virtues of the dedicated amateur. His passion for curious objects was matched by his talent for awakening the curiosity of the new museum public. Born in Copenhagen, the eldest of 6 sons of a prosperous ship owner, he was trained for business. He came to know the family of a Danish consul who had served in Paris during the French Revolution and who had brought back collections purchased from the panicked aristocracy. When young Christian, still only 15, helped his friends unpack their treasures, they gave him a few old coins to begin his own collection, and by the time he was 19, he was a respected numismatist. In 1807, when the British fleet bombarded Copenhagen harbor to keep the Danish fleet from Napoleon, buildings went up in flames, and Christian joined the emergency fire brigade. Working through the night, he rescued the coins of a leading numismatist whose house was hit and carried them to safety with the keeper of the Royal Cabinet of Antiquities. Copenhagen's newly established Royal Commission for the Preservation of Danish Antiquities was being flooded by miscellaneous old objects sent in by public-spirited citizens. The aged secretary of the commission could not face the accumulating pile. It was time for a younger man, and an opportunity made to order for Thomsen, then 27, and known for his own beautifully organized collection of coins. Quote, "Mr. Thomsen is admittedly only a dilettante," the bishop on the commission conceded, "but a dilettante with a wide range of knowledge. He has no university degree, but in the present state of scientific knowledge, I hardly consider that fact as being a disqualification." End of quote. Accordingly, young Thomsen was honored with the post of unpaid, non-voting secretary. As it turned out, Thomsen's lack of academic learning equipped him with the naivety that archaeology needed at that moment. The dusty shelves of the commission's storerooms overflowed with unlabeled odd bundles. How could Thomsen put them in order? Quote, "I had no previous example on which to base the ordering of such a collection," Thomsen confessed. Nor had he money to hire a professor to classify objects by academic categories. So he applied the common sense procedures learned in his father's shipping warehouse. Opening the parcels, first he separated them into objects of stone, of metal, and of pottery. Then he subdivided these according to their apparent use as weapons, tools, food containers, or religious objects. With no texts to guide him, he simply looked at the objects, then asked himself what questions would be asked by museum visitors who saw them for the first time. When Thomsen opened his museum to the public in 1819, visitors saw the objects sorted into 3 cabinets. The first contained objects of stone, the second, objects of bronze, the third, objects of iron. This exercise in museum housekeeping led Thomsen to suspect that objects made of similar materials might be relics of the same era. To his amateur eye, it seemed that the objects of stone might be older than similar metal objects, and that the bronze objects might be older than those of iron. He shared this elementary suggestion with learned antiquarians, to whom he later modestly gave credit for the idea. His notion was not entirely novel, but the similar notions found in classical authors were fanciful and misleading. In the beginning, according to Hesiod, Kronos created men of the golden age who never grew old. Labor, war, and injustice were unknown. They eventually became guardian spirits on earth. Then, in the Silver Age, when men lost their reverence for the gods, Zeus punished them and buried them among the dead. The Bronze Age, which followed, when even houses were made of bronze, was a time of endless strife. After the brief interlude of a heroic age of godlike leaders in their Isles of the Blessed, came Hesiod's own unfortunate Iron Age. Yet worse was still in store for mankind, a future of men born senile and of universal decay. Thomsen was not well enough educated to try to fit his museum objects into this appealing literary scheme. He was more interested in objects than in words. There were already too many books, he complained, and he was not eager to add his own. But finally, in 1836, he produced his practical Guide to Scandinavian Antiquities, which outlined his famous three-age system. This, his only book, translated into English, French, and German, and spread across Europe, was an invitation to prehistory. And this concludes part 1 of chapter 75.